Eleanor Marsh was 28 years old and standing at the end of everything she had ever known. Her boots sinking into the wet sand of a Maine harbor town, with nothing left to her name but a canvas satchel, a black wool coat too thin for the wind coming off the Atlantic, and $41 folded into a handkerchief that had once belonged to her mother. It was her late husband's business partner, a cold and calculating merchant named Reginald Voss, who had used a falsified partnership agreement to seize the shipping company she and her husband had built together, leaving her with nothing after the fever took him the previous winter. With the last of her money, she did something the entire town of Prospect Harbor would call the surest sign of a woman gone half-mad with grief. She paid $35 at a county auction for the abandoned Widow's Point Lighthouse, a crumbling stone tower that had stood dark and empty for 11 years, ever since the old keeper who tended it vanished one stormy night and was never found. An ancient sailor at the dock spat into the water and warned her plainly that the lighthouse was cursed, that no one who slept beneath its lantern room ever slept peacefully again. Yet sealed beneath the rotting floorboards of that forgotten tower lay a secret that would not only explain the keeper's disappearance, but would return to an entire fishing village the safety and the truth that had been stolen from it for over a decade. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Eleanor Marsh, if you're watching tonight from a place that others have written off as broken or forgotten. Tell us in the comments, because this story was written for you, long before the lighthouse fell dark and long before Eleanor Marsh ever set foot in Prospect Harbor. She had been raised in the coastal town of Camden, Maine, the daughter of a lighthouse keeper's daughter herself, though by the time Eleanor was born, her grandfather had long since retired from the service and taken up a quieter life mending nets and telling stories by the fire. Her father, a shipwright named Josiah Pratt, built fishing vessels with a precision that bordered on reverence. And it was from him that Eleanor learned her first and most enduring lesson, that a vessel's soundness was never determined by the shine of its paint or the polish of its brass fittings, but by the integrity of what lay hidden within its hull, in the joints and ribs no passenger would ever see or think to examine. He would run his calloused hand along a curved timber and tell his daughter that the sea did not care how a boat looked from the dock. It only cared whether the bones beneath the surface could hold against the weight of the water. Eleanor absorbed this lesson, the way children absorb the truths spoken quietly and often by parents who do not know they are teaching a philosophy of life alongside a trade. She grew into a girl who noticed the things others overlooked: the hairline crack running along a mast before it splintered, the subtle list of a boat before it capsized, the quiet dishonesty in a merchant's smile before his numbers proved false. She was not loud or boastful, but there was a steadiness in her that even grown sailors twice her age came to respect, a sense that she saw further into a thing than most people bothered to look. Her mother, Constance, had been a keeper's daughter too, raised on Monhegan Island where the wind screamed through the rocks 9 months of the year, and she taught Eleanor something equally vital: that isolation did not have to mean loneliness, that a woman alone on a rock in the middle of the sea could still build a life of purpose and quiet grace if she learned to find company in her own steady thoughts and in the rhythm of the tides. Constance had kept meticulous records during her father's years as keeper, logging the weather, the ships that passed, the small triumphs and quiet tragedies of a life spent watching for danger on behalf of strangers who would never know her name. She taught Eleanor to read those logs, to understand the particular shorthand keepers used, the way a single entry about a night with a heavy fog could carry within it an entire unspoken story of fear and vigilance. It was a strange education for a girl who might have been raised to embroider and pour tea. But Eleanor's parents believed that usefulness was its own kind of dignity, and so she grew up capable in ways that would have startled the finer families of Camden, had they ever bothered to notice her at all. At 22, Eleanor married Thomas Marsh, a gentle, ambitious young man who had inherited a small shipping concern from his own father, and who possessed a rare gift for reading tides and currents that made him the most trusted captain along that stretch of the Maine coast. Thomas adored Eleanor with the sort of devotion that never needed grand declarations, content instead to bring her small shells from distant harbors and to listen, truly listen, when she spoke of her father's boats and her mother's lighthouse logs. Together they built the Marsh and Voss Shipping Company, from a single battered schooner into a modest fleet of 4 vessels carrying lumber and salted fish between the small ports of the northern coast. And though they were never wealthy in the way the great Boston merchants were wealthy, they were comfortable, respected, and deeply happy in the way that only two people who trust each other completely can be. Reginald Voss had come into the business as a silent partner 3 years into their marriage. A smooth-talking man from Portland with capital to invest and an easy charm that made him welcome at every dinner table in town. Though Eleanor had never quite trusted the particular way, his eyes moved when he thought no one was watching him calculate dot for 6 years. The business thrived under Thomas's steady captaincy and Eleanor's careful management of the ledgers, a skill she had learned first from her mother's meticulous lighthouse logs and later sharpened through the daily necessities of running a shipping concern. She kept every account in a hand so precise that the bank manager once remarked he'd never seen a woman's books, or indeed most men's, kept with such exacting care. It was during those years that Eleanor first heard mention of Widow's Point Lighthouse, a lonely tower some 40 miles up the coast in the small fishing village of Prospect Harbor, where Thomas occasionally put in for supplies. The local sailors spoke of it in hushed, uneasy tones, describing a keeper named Amos Fenn who had vanished into a storm 11 years earlier, leaving the light untended for 3 full nights until a passing schooner wrecked upon the very rocks the lighthouse existed to warn against, killing 6 men who might otherwise have lived. The county had shuttered the lighthouse after that tragedy, deeming it cursed by grieving locals and impractical to properly staff by the lighthouse board. And it had stood dark and empty ever since, a monument to a failure no one wished to discuss. Eleanor tucked this story away in her memory without much thought, never imagining that it would one day become the entire shape of her future. The peace of those 6 years shattered in the winter of Eleanor's 27th year, when a virulent fever swept down the coast from Portland, moving through the port towns with a speed that outran every physician's remedy. Thomas caught the illness while overseeing the loading of a delayed shipment in a drafty warehouse, and within a week his robust health had collapsed entirely, his fever climbing so high that Eleanor spent 3 sleepless nights, packing him in cool cloths and forcing broth between his cracked lips, praying to a God she had never doubted until that terrible winter. He died on a gray February morning with Eleanor's hand in his last words a whispered apology for leaving her the burden of the business alone, though he could not have known how cruel a burden it would truly become. Reginald Voss arrived at the Marsh home before Thomas had even been properly buried, dressed in his finest black morning coat and carrying, as Eleanor would only later understand, a set of documents he had been quietly preparing for months. He expressed his condolences with practiced smoothness, and then, with the same smoothness, informed Eleanor that Thomas had, in the final desperate months of a difficult shipping season, signed over his controlling share of the company as collateral against a loan Voss had extended to cover a disastrous cargo loss the previous autumn. Eleanor stared at the signature on the document Voss produced, a signature that bore Thomas's general shape, but none of the particular flourish he gave the T in his own name, a detail she alone, having watched him sign 1,000 manifests and letters, would have noticed and questioned. She said as much plainly and without hysteria. But Voss had already secured the endorsement of the Camden magistrate, a man who dined regularly at Voss's table and owed him considerable favors of his own. And paper carried more legal weight in that courtroom than the quiet certainty of a grieving widow. Within a month, the company was fully seized. The 4 ships sold off to cover debts Eleanor had never known existed, and she was left with the house, which Voss's lawyers informed her carried its own separate mortgage that she alone was now responsible for repaying. A mortgage that swiftly consumed what little remained of her savings. By the following autumn, Eleanor Marsh had lost her husband, her business, and finally her home. Forced to sell the house at a fraction of its worth, simply to clear the debts Voss's scheme had left behind. She packed her mother's lighthouse logs, her father's small collection of shipwright's tools, and what remained of her clothing into a single canvas satchel. And she boarded a coastal packet boat with no clear destination in mind beyond simply putting distance between herself and the town that had watched her ruin unfold without lifting a single hand to help her. It was on that boat, listening to 2 fishermen discuss the county's plan to auction off several derelict properties along the northern coast to cover unpaid taxes, that she heard again the name Widow's Point Lighthouse, and something in her, some old memory of her mother's careful logs and her father's talk of hidden soundness beneath a battered hull, told her to disembark at Prospect Harbor rather than continue on toward nowhere in particular. Prospect Harbor in the autumn of Eleanor's arrival was a village of perhaps 300 souls, clinging to a rocky inlet where the fishing had grown steadily worse over the past decade. Ever since, as the locals would tell anyone who asked, the lighthouse at Widow's Point had gone dark, and the waters beyond the point had claimed more boats and more men than any stretch of coast had any right to claim. The county courthouse, a modest brick building at the center of the village, held the auction on a cold October morning, and Eleanor stood at the back of a small crowd of curious locals as the auctioneer described the lighthouse property: a 60-foot stone tower, a keeper's cottage in significant disrepair, and 3 acres of Rocky Point land, all to be sold for whatever sum would cover 11 years of accumulated back taxes. When the bidding opened at $20 and no one raised a hand, Eleanor understood for the first time just how thoroughly the town had given up on that stretch of rock. An old sailor named Caleb Rourke, who had fished these waters for 50 years and had known the vanished keeper personally, leaned toward her as she stepped forward to bid, his weathered face creased with genuine concern rather than mockery. "That lighthouse is cursed, miss," he said, his voice low and serious. "Amos Fenn's ghost still walks that tower, and no living soul has slept a peaceful night there since the night he vanished. You'd do better throwing your money into the harbor." But Eleanor, who had spent her childhood among lighthouse logs and her marriage among ledgers, did not believe much in curses, only in causes she had not yet uncovered. And she raised her hand and offered $35. More than enough to secure the property when no other bidder cared to compete against a woman the whole crowd assumed had lost her wits along with her husband. She walked the half-mile out to Widow's Point that same afternoon, her satchel over her shoulder, and stood for a long while simply looking up at the tower she now owned, its whitewash long since peeled away to gray stone, its lantern room dark and empty against the pale October sky. The keeper's cottage beside it had fared little better, its roof sagging under a decade of neglect, its windows boarded over by some long-ago official who had never returned to unboard them. Eleanor pushed open the cottage door, which groaned in protest against hinges gone stiff with rust, and stepped into a single room thick with dust and the particular smell of a house that has been thoroughly abandoned. That mustiness of old paper and mouse nests and time itself settling into the corners. The furniture Amos Fenn had left behind still stood in its places, as though the keeper had simply stepped out for a moment 11 years earlier and never returned, which in the strictest sense was exactly what had happened. A narrow bed frame stood against one wall, its mattress long since rotted through. A small table and 2 chairs sat before the cold hearth, and a modest writing desk occupied the corner beneath the boarded window. its surface still holding an inkwell gone dry and a stack of papers yellowed with age. Eleanor ran her hand along the desk's surface, and it was there. Examining the desk with her father's habit of noticing what others overlooked, that she first observed something odd about the floor beneath it. The wide pine floorboards throughout the rest of the cottage had settled and warped with age in the uniform way old wood does. But the boards directly beneath the writing desk sat slightly higher than their neighbors, as though they had been lifted and replaced at some point, rather than simply aging in place. Alongside the rest of the structure, she knelt down, running her fingers along the seam where these boards met the others, and found that one particular plank, roughly 2 feet in length, moved slightly under pressure in a way the surrounding boards did not. Using a small iron bar, she found among a set of tools left in the cottage's lean-to shed. Eleanor pried gently at the edge of the loose board, and it lifted away with surprising ease, revealing not simply the dirt foundation she expected, but a shallow cavity, carefully dug and lined with dry cedar shingles to keep out moisture. Clearly the deliberate work of someone who had wanted a hiding place rather than simply a gap in a poorly maintained floor. Within that cavity, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept the damp at bay for over a decade, Eleanor found her first true clue to the mystery that would consume the following weeks of her life: a leather journal, its cover embossed with the initials IF, and beneath it, a stack of letters tied with a length of tarred rope. Eleanor sat on the cold cottage floor with the journal open across her knees, reading by the thin gray light filtering through the gaps in the boarded window. And what she found within those pages made the autumn chill feel suddenly much colder than the weather alone could explain. Amos Fenn had not been the negligent keeper the town believed him to have been, the man whose carelessness had allowed his light to go dark for 3 fatal nights. His final entries, written in a hand that grew increasingly urgent and increasingly afraid across the last dozen pages, described a series of visits from men representing a Boston shipping syndicate. Men who had offered him considerable sums of money to let his light go dark on 3 specific nights in November of that year. Nights when a particular vessel belonging to a rival shipping company was scheduled to pass the point, loaded with a valuable cargo of manufactured goods bound for Portland. Fenn had refused the bribe outright, understanding precisely what such darkness would mean for any vessel attempting to navigate those treacherous rocks without guidance. And his journal recorded his mounting fear as the syndicate's representatives grew more insistent, then openly threatening, warning him that lighthouses had accidents all the time and that keepers who proved inconvenient to powerful men in Boston had a way of simply disappearing. Asterisk. The final entry, dated the very night of the storm that supposedly claimed him, was barely legible, written in a trembling hand that suggested a man working against both time and terror. Fenn wrote that he had discovered the syndicate's true purpose was not merely to sink a rival's cargo vessel, but to deliberately wreck any vessel that happened to pass during those dark nights. Collecting insurance money on cargo the syndicate itself had secretly loaded onto a decoy ship they intended to lose, while simultaneously eliminating a business rival shipment as a secondary benefit of the same scheme. He named the local agent coordinating this scheme on behalf of the Boston Syndicate as a man called Voss, a name that struck Eleanor with such force that she had to set the journal down and simply breathe for several long moments before she could continue reading, understanding with a sick certainty that the very evil that had destroyed her own life in Camden had first taken root and claimed lives here in Prospect Harbor over a decade earlier. Letters beneath the journal confirmed what Fenn's final entry suggested: correspondence between Fenn and the Portland attorney he had secretly contacted, seeking advice on how to expose the scheme without endangering his own life, along with a partial ledger, clearly copied by Fenn himself from documents he must have somehow obtained, listing insurance payouts, syndicate members, and the specific vessels involved in what could only be described as a pattern of deliberate, Maritime fraud stretching back years before Fenn's own disappearance. The scheme, as best Eleanor could piece together from the fragmentary evidence, had continued largely unchanged in the years since Fenn vanished, simply relocating its operations to darker corners of the coast once Widow's Point had been abandoned and its light permanently extinguished. No longer useful to the Syndicate now that no legitimate shipping bothered to risk that stretch of water at all. Reginald Voss, she now understood with growing horror, had not simply ruined her personal fortune through an isolated act of greed. He was, and likely had been for well over a decade, a central figure in a network that profited from deliberately drowning ships and the men who sailed them, using forged documents and coerced silence to protect a fortune built on calculated tragedy. Eleanor spent the following days making careful copies of Fenn's journal and the accompanying ledger by candlelight, protecting the fragile originals from further damage, while she considered what could possibly be done with evidence 11 years old. Evidence that named a syndicate whose full membership she could not yet identify and whose local agent had already once proven capable of arranging a man's convenient disappearance. She understood, with the same clear-eyed practicality her father had taught her when assessing a hull's true soundness beneath its paint, that she could not simply march the county authorities toward accusations against a man as wealthy and well-connected as Reginald Voss, based on a decade-old journal alone. She would need corroboration, living witnesses, and ideally some evidence that the scheme had continued into the present day. Evidence that could be independently verified by someone with no reason to doubt her. It was Caleb Rourke, the old sailor who had warned her away from the cursed Lighthouse, who ultimately became her first true ally in Prospect Harbor. Once she worked up the courage to show him a portion of what she had found, carefully omitting Voss's name until she understood how far she could trust him, Rourke listened to her account of the hidden floorboard and the journal with a growing pallor, and then told her something she had not known, that he himself had been one of the 6 men aboard the schooner that wrecked the very night Fenn vanished, having survived by clinging to a piece of the hull until dawn, while his 5 crewmates perished in the frigid water. He had always harbored a quiet suspicion that something was wrong about that night, that the darkness of the light had felt less like negligence and more like ambush, though he had never possessed any evidence beyond a survivor's grief-shadowed intuition. Together, Eleanor and Rourke began quietly gathering information from other old sailors along the coast, men who remembered strange vessels loitering near dangerous points on moonless nights, men who remembered insurance investigators who arrived, asked few questions, and left satisfied far too quickly for the scale of the losses involved. Word of Eleanor's activities at the old lighthouse inevitably reached beyond Prospect Harbor's borders, and within 3 weeks Reginald Voss himself arrived in the village, ostensibly to inspect a warehouse property he owned nearby. Though Eleanor understood immediately that her presence at Widow's Point was the true reason for his visit, he found her at the general store, purchasing lamp oil for the cottage she had begun quietly restoring, and his easy Portland charm had thinned considerably by the time he addressed her directly. "I hear you've taken up residence at that unfortunate lighthouse," he said, his eyes carrying none of their usual practiced warmth. "A strange choice for a woman in your circumstances, don't you think? Digging around in old ruins rather than accepting your situation with some dignity." Eleanor met his gaze steadily, revealing nothing of what she knew, telling him only that she had found the solitude peaceful and the work of restoration satisfying. Watching carefully as a flicker of genuine unease crossed his composed features before he mastered it once more, Voss did not simply retreat to Portland after that encounter. Within the week, rumors began circulating through Prospect Harbor that the widow at Widow's Point had lost her senses entirely, that she spoke to the ghost of Amos Fenn and was digging up the cottage floor searching for buried treasure that did not exist. Rumors that Eleanor recognized immediately as Voss's attempt to discredit her before she could gather sufficient evidence to move against him. When rumor failed to drive her away, gentler tactics followed. A representative of the county lighthouse board arrived unannounced, informing Eleanor that her deed to the property might be subject to review, given certain irregularities in the original tax auction. A transparent attempt to strip her of the very ground beneath which the truth lay buried. When Eleanor calmly produced her properly notarized deed and refused to be moved by vague threats of review, Voss himself returned a final time, offering to purchase the lighthouse property from her at triple what she had paid, framing it as a generous kindness to a struggling widow rather than the desperate bid it truly represented. Eleanor declined with the same quiet steadiness she had carried through every trial since Thomas's death, telling Voss only that some things were not hers to sell, since the truth they concerned belonged to every family in Prospect Harbor who had ever lost a son or a husband to those rocks, and not to any single person, himself included. The following weeks became a careful, escalating contest between the widow the town had first dismissed as half-mad, and the powerful syndicate agent who had built his fortune on calculated tragedy. Rourke, now fully committed to Eleanor's cause, helped her locate 3 additional survivors of shipwrecks along that stretch of coast over the preceding decade. Men and women who, once they heard fragments of what Eleanor had discovered, came forward with their own long-suppressed suspicions about insurance investigators who never quite investigated and captains who abandoned ship with unusual speed just before their vessel struck the rocks. One widow, a woman named Sarah Higgins who had lost her husband in a wreck 5 years after Fenn's disappearance, revealed that she had once found among her husband's effects a payment stub from a Boston shipping concern that made no sense, given his employment elsewhere. A stub she had kept without understanding its significance until Eleanor's questions gave it new and terrible meaning. Asterisk. With this growing body of testimony added to Fenn's original journal and ledger, Eleanor made the difficult decision to travel to Portland herself, seeking out the very attorney Fenn had once secretly contacted, a man named Elias Whitfield who, remarkably, still practiced law in that city and still remembered the anxious keeper who had visited his office 11 years earlier with vague warnings he had been unable to substantiate at the time. Whitfield, now considerably older but sharp as ever, listened to Eleanor's account with growing gravity, examining Fenn's journal and ledger with the careful eye of a man who had waited over a decade for exactly this kind of corroboration to arrive. He agreed to help her petition the State Maritime Board for a formal investigation, warning her honestly that such an investigation would take time and would likely provoke Voss into more direct retaliation before it concluded. A warning that proved entirely accurate within days of the petition being filed. Voss's retaliation came not as violence, but as a lawsuit, filed swiftly through a Boston attorney, claiming that Eleanor's restoration work at the lighthouse constituted destruction of county property and demanding both her eviction from Widow's Point and financial damages that would have ruined her utterly had the claim succeeded. Eleanor stood before the county magistrate in Prospect Harbor with Whitfield at her side, along with Rourke, Sarah Higgins, and the other survivors she had gathered, and for the first time in the entire ordeal, watched the tide of local opinion begin to turn genuinely in her favor as neighbor after neighbor recognized names and details from Fenn's ledger that matched losses their own families had quietly suffered over the years. The magistrate, unwilling to rule definitively on matters clearly beyond a simple property dispute, agreed to delay proceedings pending the outcome of the State Maritime Board's investigation. A small but crucial victory that bought Eleanor and Whitfield the time they desperately needed. The state investigator, a methodical and unflappable man named Charles Abernathy, arrived in Prospect Harbor in the deep cold of December, some 2 months after Eleanor's initial petition, and spent nearly 3 weeks cross-referencing Fenn's decade-old ledger against surviving insurance company records in Portland and Boston. A tedious process that nonetheless yielded increasingly damning results. Abernathy confirmed that no fewer than 11 vessels along that stretch of coast had been insured by policies connected to the same Boston syndicate Fenn had named. Each loss occurring during documented periods of lighthouse malfunction or unusual darkness. Each investigation concluded with unusual speed by the same small circle of insurance adjusters, several of whom Abernathy discovered through careful inquiry maintained financial ties to Reginald Voss that stretched back well over a decade. The pattern, once fully documented with modern records alongside Fenn's original testimony, was undeniable, a systematic scheme of maritime fraud and, in at least 3 provable cases including the wreck that claimed Fenn's own reported victims, direct culpability in the resulting loss of life. The formal hearing, when it finally convened in Prospect Harbor's small courthouse on a bright, cold morning in late January, drew nearly every family in the village, filling the modest room to capacity and spilling out onto the courthouse steps despite the biting wind off the harbor. Eleanor stood before the assembled state board members, Fenn's journal in her hands, and read aloud the keeper's final desperate entries in a voice that carried clearly through the silent room, describing a man who had chosen death over complicity in the deliberate drowning of his neighbors. She followed this with Abernathy's documented findings: the 11 confirmed vessels, the financial ties, the pattern of insurance fraud that had cost this small community not merely its fortunes, but its sons and husbands across more than a decade of calculated tragedy. Reginald Voss, present in the courtroom with his own Boston attorney, attempted at first to dismiss the entire proceeding as the delusion of a grieving widow and a superstitious old sailor. But his composure crumbled visibly as Abernathy methodically presented the financial records connecting Voss directly to each fraudulent insurance claim. Records that could not be dismissed as delusion or superstition by any reasonable measure. The state maritime board's ruling fell with the weight of 11 years of buried truth finally brought into the light. Reginald Voss was formally charged with insurance fraud, conspiracy, and complicity in the deaths of at least 6 men aboard the schooner that wrecked the very night Amos Fenn disappeared. Charges that would eventually be joined by federal maritime authorities once the full scope of the Boston Syndicate's operations became clear across multiple states. Voss was arrested in the courthouse itself, his fine wool coat and easy Portland charm doing nothing to shield him from federal marshals, who led him away in irons while the assembled village watched in stunned, cathartic silence, the same silence that had once, 11 years earlier, greeted the loss of 6 of their own sons to rocks a darkened light had failed to warn against. The investigation that followed implicated the wider Boston Syndicate as well, unraveling a scheme that had operated along the Maine coast for the better part of 2 decades, and leading to reforms within the state's maritime insurance practices that would make such a scheme considerably harder to repeat. Eleanor did not seek personal enrichment from what she had uncovered, though the state board did eventually see to it that the families of Voss's victims, including Eleanor herself for the theft of her husband's company, received a measure of restitution from the assets ultimately seized from the syndicate's holdings. She used a portion of her own restitution not to leave Prospect Harbor for a more comfortable life elsewhere, but to formally petition the state to reactivate Widow's Point Lighthouse, offering herself as its keeper, a request the Maritime Board, moved by both her role in exposing the syndicate and her evident understanding of a keeper's true responsibilities, readily approved. The Lighthouse Board provided funds for proper restoration, and by the following autumn, Widow's Point once again cast its beam out across the dark water each night, its light tended by a woman who understood, perhaps better than anyone who had ever held the post before her, exactly what that light was meant to protect: the village of Prospect Harbor, which had watched its fishing fortunes decline for over a decade alongside the darkened tower on its point. began slowly to recover once the light returned, and once word spread along the coast that the treacherous waters near Widow's Point were once again properly guarded. Ships that had long avoided that stretch of coast entirely began to return, bringing trade and opportunity back to a village that had nearly given up hope of ever recovering what it had lost. Sarah Higgins and the other survivors Eleanor had gathered formed a small memorial society, placing a modest granite marker near the lighthouse bearing the names of every soul lost to the Syndicate's decade of calculated tragedy, including, at its center, the name of Amos Fenn, keeper, who had died protecting the very light Eleanor now tended in his place. At 28 years old, Eleanor Marsh had stood on a cold harbor shore with nothing to her name but $41 and a grief too heavy to carry alone. Cast out by a man who believed forged paper and quiet threats could erase both her fortune and her voice. She had spent 35 of her last dollars on a lighthouse the whole town believed was cursed, warned away by an old sailor's genuine concern for her safety. And in doing so she had uncovered not merely the truth behind her own ruin, but the buried justice owed to an entire village that had spent 11 years mourning losses it never fully understood. She proved, in the same quiet, careful way her father had once taught her to judge a hull's soundness by what lay hidden beneath its surface, that the things the world dismisses as cursed or ruined are very often the things guarding the truth most faithfully, waiting only for someone patient enough to look beneath the floor. Others were too frightened to lift. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with us. Walking alongside Eleanor Marsh from the depths of her loss to the light she chose to tend in another keeper's memory. If this story stirred something in you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who might need a gentle reminder that their own worth is never determined by what others have written off as cursed or beyond saving. Before you go, tell us in the comments, what is a time in your own life when you found real value or real truth hidden inside something everyone else had already given up on? Until next time, stay close, *.